content for this panel discussion, and especially the stories of activism in the 1970s. And I can relate to that. Anybody with gray hair can relate to that. I'm going to introduce our panel moderator, and she will introduce our panelists to you. Carol Stapp has been director of the Museum Education Program at George Washington University since 1983, receiving the Excellence in Practice Award from the American Association of Museums Committee on Education in 2007. She currently serves on the Education Committee of the National Park System Advisory Board, leading the 21st Century Interpreter Initiative, and the Advisory Council of the Smithsonian National Postal Museum. In 2011 and 2012, she organized a symposium on informal learning, and this past February, she was instrumental in bringing AAM's Museums Advocacy Day to the GW campus. A past editor-in-chief of the Journal of Museum Education, Carol has published in Curator, the Museum Journal, Museum News, Historic Preservation Forum, History News, Visual Arts Research, and the Journal of American History. And she's definitely a leader in the field of museum education. And a personal note, she refined my daughter's experience. Meg, my oldest daughter, is now an associate museum educator at Smith College Museum of Art, having gone through the DW program, and hurrah for that. And she's very happy in the position because of the end. She talks about Carol's teaching all the time. So it's my pleasure to turn the podium over to Carol Stapp.
Then Elaine goes first. Each responding to an oral history question from her own experience and perspective as an EdCom activist. Each panelist will then make a recommendation, one recommendation for EdCom today, and then we should have just a few minutes for Q&A. We really want to take advantage of our presence of our panelists. It is a rare occasion to have them all together in the same room at the same time. This is really a great privilege for all of us. However, we do have to keep our eyes on the clock because we need to wrap up in time for the next round of session. But first, let me introduce our luminaries. We have Linda Sweet, and she's going to offer a first-hand account of EdCom's genesis in order to re-energize today's membership to take on exercising its collective voice. She began her museum career as an instructor in the education department of the Brooklyn Museum, and went on to be the dean of the Department of Public Education at the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston. before joining Management Consultants for the Arts as a partner in 1984. Linda specializes in executive search for top management and professional personnel, strategic planning, board development, and organizational analysis. She was a founder of EdCom and served as vice chair, that was from 78 to 80, and she was elected to the AAM Council and served on the membership committee from 1976 to 84. Bonnie Pittman, I think we can pair with Linda in providing us an in-depth understanding of the importance of a place at the table within the major professional organization for museum practitioners. Bonnie not only was a longtime member and officer of the AAM Council, but also the chair of the Accreditation Commission. In addition, she was the chair of the task force that produced Excellence in Equity. Bonnie has been a prolific author, and most recently, before her present position, was director of the Dallas Museum of Art, where she shook things up a little bit. Currently, she is the senior scholar in residence at the University of Texas at Austin. Dallas. Not married into Dallas. Okay, now we have Elaine Gurian, and she will focus on politics in order to inform and inspire current EdCom members to mobilize on behalf of their values. She is a global consultant advisor to numerous museums and visitor centers that are beginning, building, or reinventing themselves. She was a member of AAM task force that created Excellence in Equity, and Elaine has served as the AAM board treasurer, vice president, and counselor at large, a board member of AAM ICOM, a regional representative of EdCom, and the vice president of ICOM SICA. And we also have with us Ellen Munley, who will focus on strategy, starting with museums for a new century, to illustrate the deliberate steps necessary for transforming the field. She is the principal of MEM and Associates, a consulting group dedicated to enhancing the museum's public value. She served as a research assistant for AAM's Commission on Museums for a New Century that produced Museums for a New Century. That was back in 1984. She was EdCom board member and also chair, and she played a major role in developing EdCom's professional standards and the AAM's policy statement, Excellence in Equity. I think you may be picking up a little pattern here about the key role of excellence in equity. Now, each one of our panelists is going to give us an eyewitness account, as I mentioned to you, responding to an oral history question. Now, via our eyewitnesses, we're going to get the backstory on EdCom, but it's going to be in about 5-minute episodes each. So I'm going to kick things off by asking a question, and we'll have Linda, Bonnie, Elaine, and Mary Ellen respond in turn to each one individual question to carry us through sort of historically. And then after, each one is going to offer one recommendation for EdCom today. As I said, we may have some time for Q&A, and then just a few minutes for closure. All right, so Linda, please tell us, why was EdCom founded?
Okay. Everybody, close your eyes. Imagine you are alone in the dark. Now open your eyes and look around you. That's why EdCom was started. Now, educator at heart, I can't stop it. I do need to tell my personal story. So to further set the stage, it's 1973. I've been in the museum field as an educator at the Brooklyn Museum for 3 years, We are a small, passionate, creative staff with lots of ideas and lots of energy, and we're starting to do wonderful work. We have some contact with our colleagues at the Metropolitan Museum, but know nothing about what is going on in other museums in New York City, and certainly not in the country. None of us has had any training as educators or in museum work prior to taking on our positions. I had an undergraduate degree in art history, and I was working on my master's in art history. I had taught a course at the college level with absolutely no relevant experience. I was hired to be an instructor at the Brooklyn Museum, working with students grades 1 through 12 and with adults. I shadowed my predecessor, who happened to be Nina Jensen, for 1 or 2 weeks, however. That was it, and then I was on my own. Most of my coworkers were new to education, as I was, but I loved museums, believed they could change people's lives. It was 1970, and I was a product of the 60s. 3 years later, I was asked to be the keynote speaker at the AAM annual meeting. One of my Brooklyn Museum co-workers had spoken at the meeting the year before and was charged with finding someone to speak the following year. That's how things were done. It was very informal. He asked me, I said yes. I don't remember the topic, but it didn't matter to me. I knew what I wanted to do. I wanted to speak about the innovative work we were doing at Brooklyn, and I wanted to find out who else in the audience was doing similar work. Most importantly, I wanted to find colleagues, and I wanted to create an organization so we would have a way to continue to interact and network. And that's what happened. At the end of the session, a sizable group of audience members stayed on, and we took the time to discuss next steps. We structured and shaped EdCom. Then the hard part, and that was convincing the big boys. It had to be voted on at the annual business meeting. What a battle, the first of many. There was a lot of antagonism among the directors. Back in those days, the directors of the big museums did come to AAM. They simply didn't understand why the educators wanted or needed a committee, and who were these educators anyway. Thanks to 4 more seasoned professionals, all men, the decision to establish EdCom carried. And we owe an enormous debt of gratitude to Michael Spock, then the director of the Boston Children's Museum, who I just spoke to. He didn't remember a thing about it. He said, but I just stood up and said what was right, and that was true. To Harry Parker, who was then the vice director of education at the Metropolitan, but going to Dallas to take on the directorship of the Art Museum. And to the late Helmuth Naumer, who was about to be the director of the Whitty Museum in San Antonio. And Bonnie reminded me last night to Sherman Lee, the great director of the Cleveland Museum of Art. It was a shock to all of us that he would get up and support the educators. And these 4 are truly the heroes of EdCom. The battle, the intensity, the behind the scenes at the business meeting, it was great. It was really great. And you know where I learned it? I attended my first AAM meeting in 1970 or 71, and part of the session took place at the Brooklyn Museum, and there was a group called the Art Workers Coalition that came to the meeting uninvited, and they wrested the microphone from the then Joe Noble. I don't know if he was president of the AAM at that time, but they really talked to the AAM about how they weren't serving, certainly not artists, or the public. It was heady times. It was very exciting. Adrian Horn and Paul Piazza were the first co-chairs. I eventually became a vice chair, but even more importantly, sought out a seat on the AAM board, recognizing how that body affected the existence of EdCom. I had hit a chord. A lot more was going on than I had any idea about at that time. MUR, I learned, on Monday or Sunday evening, had been created 4 years earlier. I know Ken Yellis is in the room. But in New York City, we've never heard of MUR. And it took EdCom and its national role to empower MUR to become a national organization. I needed to say that. In New York City, what is now NICMR started as a component of an organization called Museums Collaborative. The Center for Museum Education was established by Marcella Brenner at George Washington University in 1975. The Museum Education Master's Program came into existence at GW. Around the same time, the Bank Street Museum Education Program came into existence. Work began on the Art Museum as Educator. The Rockefeller Foundation set up several fellowships in museum education. There was an amazing amount that was happening, and it took, EdCom to really kind of bring it all together and allow it to be paid attention to. The rest is history, an amazing group of educators working collectively since 1973, turned EdCom into what it is today, and you will turn it into the EdCom of the future. It's been a wonderful journey, and one I'm proud to have gotten started. Do I have a recommendation? Don't ever be complacent, always be vigilant.
Bonnie, would you care to add to that?
It's hard. I want to apologize first for my voice and say how happy I am to be here today. I didn't know until Friday that I could make it, and when I got permission, I was so excited, and they let me come on the panel, so that's why the time's a little extended. And Nathan, I really appreciate your gracious outreach, and to all of you on the panel for letting me join you. All of you know that the Education Committee really has been a part of my life. It's older than my son David, and many people in this room went through my marriage and David's birth, and so we count by that category, which is pretty funny. But I want to say really three things. When I came on to the scene with Linda and the others, it was a very difficult time, and we were not recognized. We almost all lived in the basement of our museums, and I think many of us still do. And then the curators were gods, and when we said we want to be gods with you, they said no. And then other people tried to tell us what to do, but it was the wrong time and the wrong place to tell us what to do. We decided to tell them what to do. And Elaine's going to give you a little bit of the background. Once I read the bylaws of the American Association of Museums and realized that we could petition to be on the board, it was all over. And at one magnanimous point, we held almost a third of the board seats. So that's what I'm here to tell you. Don't ever give up, like Linda said. I think there are three things I want to point out to you that we sometimes forget. The tax-exempt status of museums is given to us for what reason? Education. Right. So we need to keep this in the forefront of our board and our staff. We have our 501c3 status because we're educational institutions. It's at the very core of what we do. And the work throughout my career, and I know all of yours, has been about linking both the objects that we cherish and know tell these amazing stories, no matter what they are, and the people who we want to learn those stories with and from, because our community is so rich. So our educational role is there at the forefront, and as we look ahead to the coming years with laws changing and tax codes changing, we need to fight very hard and remind everyone that we are an educational institution, and at all levels. And so take advantage of that. That was a sword that was given to us in the late 60s, and we were using it a lot in the early 70s, but I think we're going to have to reignite that sword. So please remember that. The other two things I wanted to just briefly mention were excellence and equity. You probably are all too young. Elaine was, and Mary Ellen, were you on that committee? I mean, it was 25 people who didn't know the word consensus. And I was the chair, and I know that word. And 42 drafts over 4 years. And thank God the Xerox machine, the fax machine came into existence. But it came into existence in the old time where it would roll out in hot form and then disappear. And if you've ever tried to edit a document with 25 people and 42 drafts, I invite you into that room. But we were able over those years to really build consensus in the museum community by doing that work together. And we brought together history and art and museums of all backgrounds. And Elaine talked about wanting to teach in the station, Grand Central Station in New York, and at the other end of the room I had people who never wanted to have anybody look at their art but themselves. So it was a very challenging moment. But we finally got to AAM and we passed it unanimously. I will tell you there was a moment when I almost gave up, and I think that all of you should know one thing. You should find a mentor. And one of my mentors, and also Elaine's, was Joel Bloom. And we were sitting there at the table at AAM, and I was quite frankly sick of it. And it was like the 5th presentation, and everybody was yelling and telling me how we needed to change the document. And I was like, no, it's 40th draft. And I got ready to push myself away from the table and get up and walk out the room. I thought, this will show him. And Joel grabbed my hand and he said, don't you move, it will change. And that was an important lesson, because things do change if you listen carefully and build consensus. And we did. And excellence and equity, which everybody looks at the 10 recommendations and the 25 pages and say, oh, this was no big deal. It was a big deal. And it was a big deal for the field. It changed the art museum field, because they now realized they needed to do art with people and for people. And many of the museum directors still talk about it today as being a foundational document. We were able to then take E&E into the Accreditation Commission, which I chaired. And that was important because I had wonderful commissioners who worked with me to reinvigorate the commission's work in the accreditation process to allow for exhibitions and for education and for the role of the public to be a part of the mandate for institutions. And the years that I spent on the commission, the 12 years, were some of the happiest in my life. And the last thing I want to do is, there are a number of people here from the Dallas Museum of Art. Carolyn, I saw you, and who else? Stand up if you're from the DMA. Amanda was here. This is part of the magnificent team at the Dallas Museum of Art that I just want to say thank you to, because they helped me to create the last chapter, which is Ignite the Power of Art and the Framework for Engaging with Art, which changed our institution. But like so many things, like you said, Nathan, you can't do this without great people. So the great people in our institutions, each one of you make the difference. So my thanks to my colleagues and all of you that aren't here, and to the institutions I've worked in. And thank you for all of the work that you've done and are going to do. So my one recommendation is, don't sit down. Stand up and keep pushing. This is a place of possibilities, and your energy and your lives working together will make the critical difference. So thank you.
Elaine, how did EdCom gain a strong voice in AAL?
Hi. I stand on the shoulders of giants. And if I cry, it's okay. My children don't get upset, so please don't get upset. But it's a wonderful moment for me to have Bonnie here and to see all of you. I'm a hussy, is what I am. I'm a museum hussy. And I love the public spotlight, and I love the theater. I started in the 60s in the Boston Children's Museum, and I worked for Michael Spock. And what I learned about loving the public spotlight was that it redounded back to me and my institution and to the profession in ways that I didn't understand when I started, nor did I understand that it was useful in a strategic way for bringing the whole profession, the whole educators forward. I was not going to talk about feminism, but one of the things that was very clear when we started were all the educators were girls, and all the power was in the hands of men, and we all worked in the whole senior strata for men. And the notion then, this is the 60s. I worked in the Boston Children's Museum in a commune. And I showed up here in my 30s wearing combat boots, no, plastic shoes, and jumpsuits. And I walked into the bastion of people who thought that God spoke directly to them about museums, and the people in the basement were minions. So what happened really? Well, I started as I was elected to be a regional rep of EdCom, and that was the beginning of my political life. And from then on, I understood that we could leverage it all. Bonnie had figured out that they allowed petitions at the, what is now called the board? It was called the board at the time.
Council.
Council, it's now called the council. But part of the change of it has a new name and all of that was they took petitions away. And they took petitions, and it's actually still there, but they had a unitary board, and they only put up a slate in which you rubber stamp it, because what was happening was we were getting elected. And oh my God, there were people sitting on the council with the plastic shoes and talking about education and things like that. So we had as a policy that we had a person who was a hussy every year, selected for their love of the spotlight, and we organized national petitions. And every year there was an educator on the slate running against the non-educators, and every year we got elected. And out of that, Joel Bloom used to refer to us as, here comes the women's mafia. And E&E, Excellence in Equity, happened because Joel Bloom was the president, and he looked at the board, and there was the women's mafia sitting there. And he thought, what am I going to do with that? Now, Joe Bloom was a feminist. We have really Peppy to thank for this. He had a feisty daughter and a feisty wife who wouldn't let him get away with anything. He looked at the women's mafia and he said, okay, we'll write an education policy. And actually everybody thought, that's a good idea. That'll keep them quiet, it'll be bound well, and it'll go on the shelf. And when it finally came up to the final vote, I was on the board. First of all, I was on the equity side. This collaboration Bonnie is talking about it really could have been titled Excellence or Equity. And there were the equity people and the excellence people. And I wrote a long paper called The Importance of And, because and is what Bonnie put in there. And if you read the first sentence of Excellence and Equity, it says, one of the primary things is, and you go home and you think, wait a minute, primary means first. What kind of editing is this? This is not English. No, it's every sentence is conciliatory language. So what this is a strategy for putting yourself at the table. The strategy is looking at the talent for people who like to be public figures and then supporting them to go forward. What did it do? It allowed the Boston Children's Museum to have, oh my God, 2 members of the same staff on the table at the same time. And that meant we could fundraise and say we were national leaders and we weren't lying. It meant we could have friends for life. And we're talking about 45-year friendships because we were in the struggle, whatever that means. It meant that we went internationally, that I was an official of SICA in a world in which anti-American sentiment was deep then and continues to be deep now. And if you want to do something about that, go into international committees and start to make that clear. And I wrote a lot. And then one day I decided, and we were not directors. I became a deputy director and I became a chief operating officer, and all of a sudden the reins of authority were in the hands of the directors and the hands of the COOs, and we had been educators. And if you look at the history of the transference from being object-centered to people-centered, it has to do with politics. It doesn't have to do with the rightness of your argument only. It has to do with seizing the power and demanding to be at the table. And those of us who are willing to be undisciplined and loud and noisy are useful to you. So what I tell you is, politics helps your museum, politics helps your personal life, and politics helps your profession.
All right, so Mary Ellen, what strategy did EdCom pursue to shape policy and practice?
Well, thank you for asking me to be part of this sort of eyewitness account, because as you can see, that there was just an incredible amount of work and some genius and some personal commitment that put this whole thing in shape. And so I arrived in the early 1980s, and to me, you'll hear some threads from things that these guys made so clear that you were just able to absorb by the time I got there. And it wasn't that long after. My time of real active engagement was from about 1982 to 1998. And that was a time when a whole bunch of stuff was happening. In 1982, I went to the American Association of Museums to be the research assistant for Museums for a New Century. And I had the great good fortune from then on through to be sort of right smack in the middle of some incredible change that was starting to happen because people had stood up and said, we're going to pay attention to this and you're not going to forget about it. And so it's the politics, and then I think I'm sort of, I maybe represent sort of some of the other piece that comes in with that, which is there's just a huge amount of work and persistence that needs to happen. And so during this period, you see things like the Museums for a New Century, and Chapter 3 of Museums for a New Century is a statement about education, unlike one that had ever appeared before. And the "and" started to get introduced there because for the first time, a group of task force leaders from both within and outside the museum field said that what was important about museums was collections and education. Now, that didn't happen by accident. I got introduced to AAM because these guys and a couple of others came to visit me at the AAM. And so, I mean, they were just relentless. And I learned, and of course I adored them because they're also wonderful and they treated me really well, and so they're very good at that. And so, I got infused with all of this history and all of that passion, and I'm a sucker for purpose, right? And so these guys were always talking about purpose and value. So for me, it's not quite so much about strategy that happened, but it was about that focus on value and vision. And to sort of see how sort of well trained I was by all of these, I too say, what is museum education about, or the education of the public dimension we were calling it in those days? What is that all about? It's very, very simple at heart. What it's about is the work of the museum to provide access and to be able to facilitate connections. And if you can stay focused on that, then you find for the moments in time where you are, or the particular conditions that are there, the work that needs to be done in order to be able to advance that. And that was a surprising sort of transformation of the idea that part of what we were supposed to do was advocate for museums. What we were doing is we were advocating for the role of museums in society. And so, and making certain that museums came true and did that, and didn't lose sight of that's what we were supposed to be doing. And so that was where sort of I was in the mix. And so I also learned how important writing was. And so it wasn't inconsequential that there was a result out of Excellence in Equity, that there was a document. And that the people paid a lot of attention to the wording of that document. Words mattered, documents mattered, that Chapter 3 mattered, and then that combination of the work and the attention to detail and the getting it into the right places, well, the combination of all of that started to become really important. And so when I sort of thought about this question about what was the strategy, when I say that there wasn't really quite a strategy, that's also kind of not true, because it's the kind of strategy or strategic thinking that I first got introduced to in the book Composing a Life by Mary Catherine Bateson, where she talks about women and how we think about strategy and advancement. Like, it's not this straight line, but it's like this improvisational riff around a theme or some particular thing. So what we had was, we came out of what these guys were all doing with a set of guiding principles, I think, and those were things like pay attention to what's going on, speak up, keep talking, keep talking, keep talking in all directions. And then the piece that I would put to that, which folks I think are a bit modest about, is, and then there's just work. EdCom is fabulous, but it's an organization. And what really made all of this happen, or a lot of it, were some individuals, quite honestly, who just stood up, sat down at their typewriters, got on the phone, but really dedicated huge amounts of their time and their lives to pushing some of this stuff forward. I remember when I first came to AAM, I think it was my first AAM, I did not go into the room where the EdCom meeting was happening because I was scared. And I distinctly remember walking outside in the hallway, the door being a little bit cracked. Bonnie was at the podium. I knew enough to know that that's who that was. And I said to myself, I know there's something so important happening in there. I wonder what they're really doing. And wanting to sort of have that sense that that was what I was joining in terms of my life's work. And that's another piece of it that just was so important. I don't think, I'm pretty confident that I would not have known how to do my day-to-day work over the past 40 years without having the anchor of the guiding principles and the value and the vision that was embodied in what was coming out of EdCom and then the work of the individuals who were around it. That, I guess, is that sort of North Star thing, right? But now, I also have what I think is a little bit of truth-telling to say. This is the sort of the part of don't sit down and speak up. I was saying to some folks as I was thinking about coming here to talk about this, being a woman of a certain age and history right now, I'm kind of struggling with what's my voice. I was really comfortable being sort of young and a bit of a nudge, and the sort of the standing up and all that kind of stuff. And yet, as I get older, I find I want to be gracious. Like, these guys are so gracious about what the future is. They're wonderful things. They're also tough, but they say things like, oh, the future is in your hands, and this is so wonderful, everything's going to be great. And of course it is. But, the Pollyanna in me and the gracious human being in me wants to say all of that, and then there's sort of the Maggie Smith in me. And I'm not sure if that's where I'm going with my next voice, but that notion of someone who just sort of says, come on. And don't forget. In truth, and we probably already know this, but I think it's worth saying, it wasn't always EdCom that was the place where the activism happened. EdCom has been absolutely essential through this whole history. From my perspective, EdCom was the place from which a lot of this grew. It's our anchor, it's like our home base. It cannot go away, please, ever. But there were times when the work that was happening and what I thought of as I was thinking this through, in the sideshow, there was a whole sideshow going on, where beside EdCom and what it was doing. EdCom gathered the membership, took care of them. EdCom did the sessions for the annual meetings and went forward with professional development. And there was this sideshow of getting people onto the board. There was this sideshow of excellence in equity. There were battles going on, both political and sort of a governance structure strategic, and ideas that were not yet ready to be able to be either brought forward nor endorsed by the leadership or the members of EdCom. When excellence in equity came forward, much to my embarrassment as one of that was then on the EdCom board, also in excellence in equity, EdCom did not endorse excellence in equity when it first came out. It didn't fight it, but it did not endorse it. And some of what was going on, and some of it I think is maybe still in the stream today, is there are real challenges for museum educators in the statement that museums are about collections and education, that museums are about excellence and equity. And what happened is there were genuine, there was concern, there were fights, there were disappointments. As we switched the language from museum education is about teaching to museum education is about learning, huge battles. When the language shifted from this is about museum educators to this is about museum education, huge battles. Go back and look. The first time that Standards for Museum Educators was published in Museum News in the late 1980s, it was called the Standards for Museum Educators. We had a huge battle when it changed to the Standards for Museum Education. It was so risky to do that, I can't even tell you. And then growing into what did that mean? And the conundrum that it really puts museum educators in terms of, and what really is my role? What is it that I'm carrying? If the whole institution is about this, what's going on here? And so we too fell victim to wanting to hold on to what we knew, where we thought our power was, what we thought our work was. And that's my little sort of, truth-saying bit that says, an extremely essential role that I think EdCom has played and can continue to play is being big, being that grassroots political base that matters hugely. Because on that sideshow, when people were doing that, the fact that EdCom was there and it was as large as it was made a huge difference. That notion of being able to have the grassroots matters enormously. And then this business about doing the work. These guys, nobody asked anybody to write ethics, coincidentally. Nobody asked anybody to put together a task force on education. Nobody but them and us, right? We made work for ourselves because we saw where the gaps were and what the needs were. And so I guess that would be my recommendation to all of you, is notice where the gaps are. Pay attention to what is disturbing you. Pay attention to what's disturbing others. The brilliance of noticing what's not there, and then making the work to make it happen. If I were to identify a couple of areas where that seems to be in play right now, it's this notion of public value, museums and public value, and what do educators have to contribute to that. If I were to look at those 5 core documents that were presented the other day, I understand at the general meeting about what every museum needs, I would say what's not there. I think there's a couple of things that aren't there. And I would go with, personally, I'm really looking a lot at early childhood education in the country. It's a huge national issue. Museums are not there. So I mean, there's opportunities in this particular time, but there's a huge amount of work to do with it. And there's the combination of get to the political figures, figure out how to play with AAM, but also keep doing your thing. Have the combination of the sideshows, the political capital, and all of that, which across this history, I think you see the evidence of, you don't know you're doing it at the time, but now we have the capacity to sort of see a little bit of how it happened.
I invite you to linger for a few moments if you can, and perhaps you can.
Is there
engage
time
in
for
some
any
conversation.
questions?
I don't think if we're going to get
5 minutes.
to the next session. All right, well, if we do have a brief question or two.
Microphone.
This microphone.
Yeah. Speak up, we can probably hear.
My question is simply, is the session being recorded? Because I would, as
Yes,
many of
right
us-
there.
Yay.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
YouTube, it'll go viral.
Mary Ellen, while you're thinking of your question, because 3 of you have to ask a question before we leave the room. It was at the meeting that I told you about when the chair of the Education Committee stood up and said they would not endorse E&E for all the reasons that she just mentioned, because it was a shift in expression and the inclusion. Their point was, we're in charge of education, you're saying the whole institution is involved in education. And that was the moment that I pushed back from the table and said, if I've spent my whole life, and it was 1992, and we were founded, in 78, it was years of work on this. If our own committee won't endorse this, what am I doing? But thank God, things change. Anyhow, so somebody ask a question. Yeah.
I'd love to ask a question. I didn't get on the train until probably mid-90s, so this has been very useful for me. I really, really appreciate the insights. It's tremendously helpful. I'm a board member on EdCom. My question is about the 5 documents. And I'm curious to hear the language over time. Elaine, I think you used the word public dimension, is
Yes.
that? And now the word is sort of visitors or visitor-centric, and then there's the word visitor experience, visitor engagement, there's all kinds of words. When I heard the 5 documents, and we had a little tiny conversation in this week's board meeting, my thought was to have a vision for the visitor experience as one of the 5 documents. But I'd like to ask you, what would you put the education word on it? Would you put the visitor experience word on it to get sort of a summary of that tradition onto the 5 documents list? What would that look like?
We probably all have a different answer.
I would put something else on the table as well that goes with this, and that is, what does the organizational chart look like? I never allow with my client base, or I work very hard not to allow the word education to have. Because education, and that word has a meaning for organized school engagement, especially around the world, and what I'm talking about is the public engagement. And therefore, it's not quite clear what this job is, as Mary Ellen said, nor its relationship with the senior staff and the power structures within your own museum. And therefore, spending time at what your name should be, what your job description should be, and what it is in relation to in the power structure is also worth doing. When I came to the Smithsonian, you could not, as a public, as a curator who did not publish in jury journals, rise within the curation department. Nor could you be a vice president for public program at the same pay scale as the curation. This stuff is the same as politics about getting elected, which is look at the infrastructure, look at the word choice, and look at the relationship to the seats of power, and that's the stuff you should pay attention to.
What I'm finding with some of the projects that I'm working on is the document that places are trying to develop, which they found that wasn't there in the list, is something that's either something like a vision statement, or some of them are calling them statements of public value. And it's a little different than, that's actually quite a bit different, I think, than from just even the visitor engagement, because it's what's the document that answers the question, and why does this matter? So that as one of the guiding documents that any institution needs to have. And along with that, at someday, it may be that one of the important documents is also going to be whatever the equivalent of an annual report is, or a report that says, we did this and we have this kind of impact. So those are 2 things that are missing in that configuration from what I'm seeing.
I haven't seen the 5, so I'm speaking out of context, and I'd love to get them from you. But I'm, as usual, going to present a counterpoint to Elaine and say that I am, not knowing the context, I'm unafraid of the word education. I think it's a word that we should own. We may need to define it in new ways. I love the new language of engagement, participation, and all these other things. In the end, let's be honest, what we're trying to do is help people learn and connect with works of art or history and learn those stories. So for me, the word is a powerful word, especially now. So I would find a way to articulate it. As those of you who do not know me, I'm always in that middle path on the edge of changing things, but finding that way to do it so that the others who think they're in opposition don't know that they failed.
I would just like to say, from the point of view of the work I do now, which is in executive search and where I assist museums in identifying new directors, museum educators make fabulous directors. It's not the right job for everyone, and that is something you need to work out for yourself. But if you truly want to affect change, the way Bonnie affected change at Dallas was by becoming a director. If you look like and people like Danielle Rice and many, many others who started their careers as educators. It's truly going to make a difference to our institutions to have educators become directors.
Hi, do you have a question?
Can I ask a question or make a comment? Because I thought that Marcella said was good. And part of the nature of the discussion that we had the other day at the board meeting was the fact that, when these first documents were, back in the 70s, there was no real statement like excellence and equity or anything like that. But now part of the core documents require a educational, that your mission be education-based. So we were talking about, is there some sort of redundancy to have both an education statement and an education mission? And then we also looked around the room to find, educators are not nearly as marginalized as they were before. There are voices everywhere. So how many of us actually even have those in our own museums was sort of appallingly small. And so what does that look like? And one of the other things that were mentioned too is that there's yet, maybe this indicates the battle that you were speaking about, there's not even any consensus about what museum and good museum education is or ought to. We can't even agree on a term. Is it informal learning, or so if we can't even speak the same vocabulary yet, what are we even completely advocating for?
That's where I think, again, something that I learned from these guys is the language matters and the words and all that, it matters. But where you get your guidance is by saying it's about access and it's about connection. And if you put everything, if you put what you're doing in conversations through those filters, then you can at least continue to have conversations about it and do some work and vet it and improve it and that kind of stuff. I don't know if that's helpful, but that's the way I lived through all this confusion about is it education or isn't it, and am I an educator or am I I don't know what they're saying.
One more.
I just want to let everybody know, AAM is having at the showcase in the exhibit hall at 2:30. They're doing a flash session about the core documents, and we are all invited to go there at 2:30 to continue this conversation. I think it'd be great if this is something we're concerned about, that we take it to AAM, we talk about it with them,
Stand up.
talk about a chance to stand up. This is at 2:30 at the exhibit hall.
Thank you. All right. And one thing to build on what you heard today, and that is, remember, they were frontline museum educators, banded together, rose through the ranks, and made a big difference. Think about it. You can be who does that next, and your story will be told in 40 years.
It takes a while. It takes patience.
I won't be here in 40 years to celebrate, thank heavens, but I know many of you will be. And I want to celebrate all of you taking time today to come and recognize the huge achievements that individuals made and collectively made a difference in our profession. So to all of you today, thank you for this time. Thank you.